Hey everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with the sale or lease contingency exhibit, and this is part one. So this week's tip is the sale or lease contingency exhibit from a buyer's perspective. Stay tuned for the next contract tip, which will be part two, and that will be the sale or lease contingency, having to deal with that in a contract from a seller's perspective. So from a buyer's perspective, nowadays we have a buyer that lives in house A and wants to buy house B. In order to do so, they write a contract and they make their purchase of the new home contingent upon their existing home either selling or getting a lease on that property. So in order to write that up and write out all those contingencies in the contract, there is a sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit. I am just going to address the GAR contracts. These exhibits are also available. An exhibit to provide for this contingency is also available in the RE forms contracts. But for the purposes of this video, I am going to discuss the GAR. So on GAR form F90, it is sale or lease of buyer's property contingency. And the first thing you do is you fill in the offer date, because this is going with the buyer's offer, and you put in the property address of the house that they are buying, the new house. Then it states that buyer warrants that they own real property, and you put the address of their current existing home, and that the buyer has taken or is taking the following actions to sale or lease their existing home. And then you put in whatever it is that the buyer is doing at this point. Are they getting ready to list it? Has it been listed? Is it under contract? And if it's under contract, you know, where within that contract is it? That's initial A. Then initial B states this agreement, meaning the agreement for the buyer to purchase the new home, this agreement is contingent upon the following occurring on or before, and there's a fill in the blank for the date. You guys, you need to fill in that date. So I'll come back to the date in a second. So this agreement is contingent upon the occurrence of the following on or before blank, which would be a date, which is the contingency period. And then you select either one and or two. And it says the buyer closing on the sale of the other property, or the buyer entering into a lease of the other property with a lease term of at least blank amount of time. So what this means, this is the contingency that you need to fill out. So it says basically the agreement for the buyer to purchase the new home is contingent on either the buyer closing on their existing home or getting a lease for 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is that they would need to be able to move on with the new purchase. On or before, so they must close on their new home or get that fully executed lease on or before a date. So typically a buyer is going to fill in the same date on this contingency exhibit as they would fill in for the close date of the new home they're buying, so they can do a back-to-back close. So they would put up their house for sale, or it's already for sale, and they would need to close on existing house on or before the same date that they're closing on the new house, or get a lease for however many months. Now, some sellers won't accept that, and they'll say, no, I am not going to do a back-to-back closing. Buyer, you must, the only way I'll accept this contingency is if you close or get a fully executed lease on your current home before we are scheduled to close on this home. But regardless, you have to put on a date. It is a contingency period. Any contingency in the contract has a date that well, not any, but the majority of contingencies in our contracts, they have a date that the contingency must be met by which it must be met. So then it says, paragraph C, buyer agrees to use buyer's best effort to fulfill that contingency. In other words, to close on that house or lease it. Reference above, prior to the expiration date of that contingency period, which is that date that you fill in. In the event that the contingency period ends without any contingency referenced above being fulfilled, this agreement shall terminate. The contingency or contingencies referenced above may be waived by the buyer upon notice to the seller if it's given prior to the end of that period. So what that means is, let's say that you write the contract for the buyer's new home and you are scheduled to close August 31st. And in the contingency, in this contingency exhibit, you put that the buyer, the purchase of the new home is contingent upon the buyer closing on their existing home August 20th. So let's say the buyer does not get their home sold and they don't close August 20th. August 20th comes and goes. The buyer is not able to meet that contingency, meaning they weren't able to close on their existing home. They didn't get a fully executed lease for that time frame on their existing home. It's now August 21. The contract for a new home automatically terminates. So the contract is now terminated because the buyer did not meet the contingency. And now you as the buyer's agent, you'll have to execute the TNR, the termination release agreement, in order to get agreement on the disbursement of the earnest money. The earnest money would go back to the buyer because the contract on new home was contingent on this. They didn't meet it within the time frame. It automatically terminates the day following whatever date you filled in, and it terminates. The other part that says that this contingency may be waived by the buyer if they give notice to the seller, as long as that notice. So what that means is buyer is not able to close on their new house on August 20th in this example that we put in on this contingency, but they still want to go through and purchase the new home. Prior to August 20th, prior to 11:59 p.m. at night on August 20th, the buyer needs to get a notice form and write a notice to the seller that the buyer, him or herself, is removing this contingency, this sale or lease contingency, and they are going through with the purchase of the new home, even though they were not able to sell their current home. That's what that paragraph means. Okay, so far so good. Now, paragraph D, that has it's called a kick-out provision. And the kick-out is only in existence if the buyer and seller agree to it. So what that states, and the buyer and seller, the buyer initials would have to initial by that kick-out. What that states is the seller shall have the right to continue to offer the property for sale. In the event the seller receives an acceptable offer to purchase the property, the seller shall be give the buyer notice of the same. So if the kick-out provision is in play, the buyer and the seller agree to a kick-out provision. Seller says, okay, buyer, I'm going under contract with you. I am agreeing that this whole purchase and sale, this whole closing transaction is contingent upon you selling your home, closing on your home on or before, again, let's just stick with the same example, August 20th, but I have a kick out. That means I get to continue to market my home for sale. If I get another acceptable contract, I send you a notice that, hey, I've got another contract I want to accept. I'm already under contract with you. So, but I have to give you notice that I've got another one I want to accept. Then the next paragraph says, buyer shall then have blank hours, and it's typically 24, 48 hours after receipt of the notice delivered from the seller, after receipt of the notice from the seller that they have another offer they want to accept, to deliver. The buyer then has 48 hours, let's say, to deliver to the seller an amendment to this agreement signed by the buyer, where the buyer removes all contingencies in favor of the buyer. So, well, let me just read it and then I'll go over it. Any due diligence period, agreement, and deposit with the holder additional earnest money of blank dollars. In the event the buyer does not deliver within the time period stated above, the signed amendment to the seller and additional earnest money, if there's any reference above, the holder to the holder, then this agreement shall terminate and the buyer is entitled to a refund of the earnest money. In the event the buyer does deliver the amendment, then the seller is obligated to go through with it. Okay, so what all that means is seller's under contract with this buyer, and there's a kick-out provision that they agreed to. Seller now gets another offer that they want to accept. They send a notice to the buyer, hey buyer, we've got another offer we want to accept. The buyer then has whatever time frame they agreed to, 48 hours, to tell the seller, nope, I just cannot go through with it. I am just not willing to take on 2 mortgages, or I'm not financially qualified to take on 2 mortgages, so I am not able to remove the contingencies in order to purchase this sale. So I'm not able to do it. It terminates. The buyer gets their earnest money back, and seller goes on with contract number 2. Or the buyer receives the notice from the seller that they got another contract they want to accept. Buyer says, yes, I still want this new home. I'm going to go through and close on this house. If they're going to do that, then the buyer must send to the seller the amendment to remove the contingency of the lease of buyer's property. And that is GAR Form F-103. And basically, the buyer fills that out and sends it to the seller. So if the seller initiates the kick-out, and the buyer is not in a position or doesn't want to be in a position to take on the 2 mortgages because they haven't yet sold their home, terminates, and buyer gets earnest money back, seller goes on with buyer number 2. If buyer says, yes, I want the house, then buyer then sends the seller the amendment to remove it. But what it does is it removes not only the contingency to sell or lease their current house, it removes all contingencies in favor of the buyer. There is no more financing contingency for the buyer, there's no more appraisal contingency for the buyer, and there's no more due diligence time frame for the buyer. So the buyer at that point, if they are issued the kick out and they do want to proceed, that's it. All contingencies for the buyer are removed from the contract, and they go through with the closing. If the buyer does send the seller that amendment saying, yep, we're going through with it, you're staying with us, the seller is obligated to stay with the primary contract, with this contract. The seller then doesn't have the choice to still go with contract 2. So that's it from the buyer's perspective. However, and it does, so basically, if the buyer does, okay, let me back up. So there's 2 kinds of buyers. There's a buyer that I absolutely cannot qualify for house number 2, the new house I want to buy, because I still have a current mortgage I'm paying on my existing home. I just won't qualify. So if I'm the buyer and I get this notice of the kick out, if I'm not able to do it, I'm not able to do it. I'm going to have to terminate and let the seller sell it to somebody else. I will get my earnest money back, and agents, you still need to do the TNR to disperse the earnest money with signatures. So that's a buyer that either they just financially can't qualify. You have other buyers where they can financially qualify, but they don't want to take on 2 mortgages. That's a decision that buyer will have to make if they are going to go through with the contract on the new house or not. Then you have another buyer, so I guess 3 buyers, that, you know what, I made the purchase of this new home contingent upon selling my existing home because I don't want to carry 2 mortgages, but financially I am in a position to carry 2 mortgages. So if I really, really, really want this new home, then I am going to go through with this new home regardless if I sell my existing home or not. Again, that depends on a lender, if there's a loan involved, if I can qualify. So those are the scenarios for that. Now, if the seller has sent a notice has initiated the kick out for the buyer, and the buyer decides to go through with it, they're removing all contingencies, and basically if they terminate for any reason, they will default on the contract, and they would either be in position to lose their earnest money or potentially be sued for the default. However, the one exception to that is if the buyer is getting an FHA insured loan or a VA insured loan. Because if the seller initiates a kick out, buyer says, yes, I'm going through with it, all contingencies are removed from the contract. However, you know from classes or my previous videos that an FHA insured buyer or a VA insured buyer, that the appraisal contingency on those loans goes through day of closing regardless of any time frame. But let's say, okay, well, this kicks out that time frame. However, you guys know that on an FHA loan, VA loan, that the FHA loan exhibit and the VA loan exhibit control. And in the GAR form, it's GAR F63. Paragraph 11 is the amendatory clause. It's the same paragraph in the VA loan exhibit. And it basically says that notwithstanding anything to the contrary, that if the property does not appraise on the FHA exhibit, you fill in the sale price. On the VA, it says reasonable value as determined by the VA, then the buyer has the right to terminate under no penalty. Meaning, if the buyer is buying new home, buyer's getting an FHA loan, VA loan. Seller exercises a kicks out, buyer goes through, appraisal is then done, house doesn't appraise. Under those circumstances, regardless of the amendment to remove the contingency, and it removes all contingencies, the buyer, if the house doesn't appraise, FHA or VA, the buyer will get their earnest money back, because on those government insured loans, those exhibits control. And on the GAR form, it does have paragraph 21, exhibit controls. This exhibit shall control over conflicting or inconsistent provisions set forth in the agreement. So that's just one little twist on that I wanted to bring to your attention. So again, you guys make sure you are using the proper forms. Agent-to-agent communication when you are dealing with specific notices is not effective. That is not notice. So make sure you use the notice form. Make sure you're using the proper amendments and the proper exhibits, and pay attention to the time frames. Also for the provision for additional earnest money, if the seller initiates a kickout, the buyer wants to stay in it, and there is a provision in the sale or lease contingency exhibit as well as in the amendment regarding additional earnest money. Again, the buyer and the seller can negotiate that amount to zero. That's just something that gets negotiated when the parties go under contract up front. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this contract tip helped you out. Stay tuned. I'm getting ready to do another video tip on this same topic, the sale or lease contingency exhibit, but this one will be from the seller's perspective. So thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.